Hello everybody, I'm Justine Hopkins. I am the step-granddaughter of the artist whose work is on display here today, Michael Ayrton, and that's a signature from one of his paintings. 2021 is the centenary of Ayrton's birth, and here in the Fry 2 gallery in Saffron, Walden, we have put on an exhibition which tries to cover some of the startling range of work that he produced during his career. The exhibition, which has been put on with the help of the Goldmark gallery, is one of two with which we are celebrating Ayrton's centenary. It's particularly appropriate that the exhibition takes place here in Saffron Walden because Ayrton spent the larger part of his working life at Toppesfield in North Essex, not very far away, and is actually buried in Hadstock churchyard, which is, I think, about a quarter of an hour's drive from here. So this is very much Ayrton's territory, if you like. And the sculptures and paintings, drawings on display take us through his career, really, from the very early days up to some of the works here which were produced in the final years of his life. So he began as a painter, and it's over here that we have some of the early works. He was fascinated by landscape particularly, and by that particular anthropomorphic relationship between man and the landscape he inhabits, which is so much part of the neo-romantic movement. And if we look at this from the Fry Gallery's own collection, Winter Drought, which has just been restored, is a very fine example of the way that he takes the landscape and almost creates a sense of the maze-like quality, and this is something, mazes would follow Ayrton right through his life. At this point, he's recording the landscape, but it takes on a maze-like quality, and the tree, the fallen tree in particular, in the foreground here, is almost human in its quality. It looks like a kind of monster within the landscape, and he also creates this very strong movement through, and you don't realise that you're looking at what should be a river until you see that it curls right round and it's going under a bridge in the distance, and so that you get more information about the painting as you look at it, and that strong sense of movement through the sky. Ayrton had been living in London, in fact, at this point, but he went into Wiltshire and Gloucestershire and to the Pembrokeshire coast, where he worked for a while with Graham Sutherland, and the coastline comes out in ebb tide here, where the gull, in a sense, focuses the picture. So these are paintings of a kind of desolation in the landscape. There is an edge to these pictures. Although they are landscapes, they are definitely not pastoral, and that there is an edge to all of Ayrton's work at this point. If we look over here, we can see he started to plan a film based on Berlioz's Damnation of Faust, and this was the headdress that he designed for Mephistopheles, which the part was going to be done by Massine. It would have been a high, wide and handsome production. Unfortunately, due to various issues, the film was never made, but Ayrton's fascination with and passion for Berlioz continued throughout his life. And as you can see from these drawings, the kind of production, but also the style. Ayrton at this point is very influenced by the German painters, by Matthias Grunwald and Albrecht Dürer. There is an edgy, linear quality to his drawing and his painting, which changes when he first goes to Italy in the late 1940s. And there's only one drawing from that period, but you can see, I think, that there is a change taking place in the image here, again from the Fry's collection, of the woman with her children. And this was a drawing done in a square in Naples, and it is indicative of Ayrton's other great fascination, which was people and how they live their lives and what their lives look like. By the time he's drawing this, and you can see how it's much more three-dimensional than anything that he produced through the early 40s. And he is moving by this time into sculpture. And in fact, the earliest sculpture in this collection, which is the figures on a jetty, this too was based on his Italian travels, and these figures were all based on swimmers that he drew in and around the Bay of Naples. He liked to use the naked human figure, but only in action. And this is why in the early days he concentrated on bathers, because bathing is really one of the few activities where human beings are relatively relaxed about being nude. And he wanted these bodies just doing ordinary actions rather than posed in a studio. And he's already beginning to experiment with complicated designs. You look at the four figures, but of course there's a fifth underneath the jetty, suspended. So the idea of making sculpture which constantly produces new aspects, draws you in, is something that starts very, very early. And he was also fascinated by the way that bone makes sculpture, and at the same sort of contemporary with the figures on a jetty is the earliest of his creatures, and this is Scavenger, the head based on the skull of a rat, and the creature itself modelled with bone and wax on a metal armature. Now, as you can see, I think this creature fits very neatly into that darker sort of early painting aspect of Ayrton's work. There's something inescapably sinister about it. It could well have prowled through some of his early paintings. But by the time he started making his sculptures in the middle 1950s, Ayrton was on the edge of the discovery, the adventure, if you like, that would change everything that he was doing in both sculpture and painting. And it's here that the Goldmark collection really comes into its own, because thanks to their collection, the exhibition includes a group of Ayrton's Minotaur etchings, because in 1956 he came first to Cumae, where he discovered the story of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus, of course, built the maze in which the Minotaur was entrapped. From that time, Ayrton began tracing this story and adding elements, and nowhere is it more evident, really, than in his collection with the Minotaur. There are many artists have made Minotaurs, Picasso among them, but no other artist before Ayrton had suggested that the Minotaur had once been a baby, and the little Minotaur calf in the labyrinth, before he even knows he's a monster, is an enchanting image. And Ayrton went on, followed the life of the Minotaur, growing up, discovering himself in Risen, where he looks at his own hand with an expression that's, I know this is going to be useful for something if I could only work out what. Michael had a great sympathy for the Minotaur, and he saw him not just as a monster rightfully concealed in a maze, but as a creature struggling to come to terms with itself. And so he grows up, considers sex, sees himself revealed as a bull, and Ariadne plays an important part in the story, as she does in the etchings. Here in Pent, they sit either side of a maze wall, and finally the Minotaur is alone, and that quality of loneliness was for Ayrton very much part of the modern condition. He saw the Minotaur, as I say, not just as a legendary monster, but as part of all of us. And he said of these mythical beings that he created, they are human and they've lived lives and they are your fault and mine. We imagine Minotaurs because we want to banish the monster. Ayrton suggests that we may in fact rather be trying to banish part of ourselves. And he never painted the Minotaur. He made these etchings, and he made him in bronze, ranging from the Minotaur revealed, almost abstract. And the wonderful thing about Minotaur revealed is that he actually exists out of a bull's skull. So he grows out of his own death, and the savagery of the skull behind, going back to that those early beginnings of sculpture using bone. Here it's a full-size bull's skull, and then out of it the Minotaur's head with vestigial horns seems much less threatening, and it's the idea of giving life to the creature. And then one of his latest Minotaurs, the little Minotaur waking, again this staring at the hand. And in some ways, Ayrton's Minotaurs have become even more relevant to the way we live our lives today. And the expression on his face is very much the expression that one wears when suddenly the computer's gone down again. And you're sure you know it can do things, but you don't have the knowledge to fix it. Just as the Minotaur can't use his hands. He knows they ought to be useful, but his bull's head just can't work out why. And that confrontation with technology you can't quite understand is a very modern dilemma. Ayrton always found in his myths aspects that were modern. For him, myths were not just about stories, children's stories that you read and think how quaint they are. They were urgently addressing the needs and the ideas of the human race, and part of our desire to understand ourselves. And the Minotaur evolves, therefore increasingly becoming human. And of course the largest Minotaur of all that Ayrton made is on the London Wall at the Barbican, the Arkville Minotaur, as he's known from his original, who lives in a full-size masonry maze in the Catskill Mountains in New York, which Ayrton was commissioned by a Wall Street billionaire to create there after he wrote the novel The Maze Maker, which tells the story of Daedalus, Icarus and the Minotaur. But for Michael, his whole feeling about the Minotaur was really summed up in personal Janus. Janus, the Roman god of doorways, who looks to the past and the future at once, and from whom we get the name of the month January. Here, Michael created a Minotaur artist, Janus. What you don't know is which of them is looking which way. So there's an ambiguity there, coming together, an identification which was central to the work that he did. But he was also fascinated by the relationship between Daedalus and Icarus, and between Icarus and the sun. And this piece here, which is again part of the Fry Gallery's collection, Sun Maze, he picks up on all these ideas. It's a piece which tells different stories as you walk around it. From one side, you see Icarus flying up from the sun, and the sun sort of melting around him, and you can see the drips. This was modelled in wax, and you can see where the wax has been allowed to run down the side of the sculpture, and it's a reminder of the way that the story of Icarus is told, that his wings made of wax and feathers melted when he came too close to the sun. And here Icarus actually seems to take off from the sun against this blazing background, while on the other side there is a maze. And so from the back, or is it the back of the sculpture, what we see is a maze. It's a proper labyrinth in which you could get hopelessly lost. There are 7 decision points if you want to find your way to the centre. And the maze too seems to melt down. If you get sideways on it, you realise that maze and sun complete each other. The maze is in the sun, or the sun rises out of the maze, and Icarus flies away from both of them. Icarus, for Ayrton, was not just, again, a figure of legend, as he once described it, an idiot boy who flew to his death and did nothing else. He was also the pilots of World War II, whom Ayrton had encountered when he was briefly drafted into the RAF at the beginning of the war. He wasn't allowed to fly, so he found it endlessly frustrating to watch them coming and going. And his childhood poliomyelitis had left him with a slight limp, so he wasn't fit for aircrew. But as ground crew, he watched them, and they became part of Icarus, as did the astronauts undergoing tests of high velocity testing before the first moonshot. This piece, the Diedlucicus Matrix, again, it's a small model, a maquette for the other Arkville sculpture. So in Arkville, in this maze, with 2 chambers at the centre, there is a Minotaur in one, and in the other the figures of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus, the maze maker, part of the maze comes out of Daedalus. Daedalus is both the maze maker and the maze makes him. And then off his shoulders, Icarus flies upwards, but they are still connected by a kind of umbilical cord which ties them together. So without the craftsman, you can't have the hero. But equally, the craftsman without the hero is left with no climax to what he creates. And that duality and dichotomy is part of what Ayrton explored in The Maze Maker, in his novel, which reads as a fictionalized autobiography of Daedalus. So all of these figures sort of flesh out a myth, the myth that Ayrton found, the very simple, basic myth of Daedalus, Icarus, and the Minotaur, and he added more and more details, and they emerge in his sculpture as he examined the idea, turned it around, and turned it into art. And he always said that being an artist was about discovering what in essence is real by making images. And by making these images of the myths, he found that they continued to be real, and that myths continue to be important. The figure of Talos, the mythical guardian of Crete. Talos was supposed to be made of bronze and to keep Crete safe from its enemies. For Ayrton, it was never going to be as simple as that, having grown up through the Second World War. He had not much patience with the idea of military force as being the guarding safety of any nation. So his Talos figures and his sentinels are literally, as well as figuratively, armless or harmless, and their heads are very small. So they don't think, they can't actually do anything, but they look very powerful. If you want to push that a bit further, you could start thinking whether it's actually a very good idea for those who are defending whatever, not to be able to think. One of the wonderful things about Ayrton's sculptures is that the more you take them apart, the more you examine the implications of what they do, the more you find inside them. And that is also true of the way that the Minotaur also metamorphoses into a kind of Dionysiac figure. Dionysus, the god of wine, the god of disorder, the opposition to Apollo, the god of light and order. And here you can see still unmistakably a Minotaur, but with the attributes of Dionysus, the wine cup, against this background of foliage. And again, the idea that myths spread and they generate more myths. And the other, so you had the great complexity of myth, but also images that are completely simple, like the Daedalus head, which is just one of the early Daedalus images, Daedalus after his son's death, and the sense of loss. And the sense also, which became an important part of the whole idea for Michael, the idea that he never really understood, Daedalus never really understood what Icarus was doing. It seemed to him a ridiculous idea, because it was all about one splendid moment and destruction. And as Daedalus phrased it, I am a craftsman and what I make exists. What Icarus would make does not. And I find it hard to forgive that it was never, that he did not need to do more. That idea that you can make a single splendid gesture and be remembered forever. And that's a theme that sort of winds through. And again, that one that's very relevant to today. And particularly a felicitous piece of hanging in the gallery. We have this maze core, part of a series of collages in which are contemporary with the Daedalus and Icarus theme, in which and sort of explores the idea of not just the maze as a built object on the ground, but the maze inside the earth, the maze, the geological maze, if you like, but also the maze inside the human brain. And you can see the shape of the brain here. And more he came to see Daedalus as not just a builder of mazes, but also a man trapped in a maze, and the whole of human life as a maze through which we move as we try to work out our lives. So as I say, these two come together particularly well in within the exhibition. The final aspect of this idea of the maze brought Ayrton to what turned out, sadly, to be the last phase of his sculpture, and those are the reflecting sculptures. So the idea, I'm deep in, actually also relates to the maze idea, the idea of maze, the womb as a maze, or the maze as a womb, in which the figure hides, in which it is imprisoned. And for Ayrton, mazes always had this duality about them. They both contain to protect, but also imprison. So are you being saved or are you being prevented by the maze? And here the maze can be again, a prison or a place of birth. And you can see the great slab of bronze here mimics the idea of the womb and the birth canal. But it was the discovery of neutral density Perspex that really gave Ayrton his final inspiration as he worked with the maze. Neutral density Perspex is a kind of plastic which both reflects and is translucent, transparent, so you can see through it and see things reflected in it. And Ayrton produced a series of sculptures, of which this is one, geode. And as the sculpture turns, you can see there is actually only one figure here. But as the sculpture turns, another figure appears, and figure and geode interpenetrate each other. So in a way, we're back to the idea of man in the landscape, But now the maze is about perception as well as being about an actual physical object. And he took up again the idea of Apollo and the whole relationship of Apollo as the sun, Apollo as the god, the possible relationship of Icarus to Apollo, which becomes almost a sexual one, or overtly a sexual one in the book. Here, the figure, the head, actually completes. There's only a half head here, but at a certain angle of the sculpture, you can see it as a whole. The head completes itself, and you see the face of the god, partly through a glass darkly, or as that quotation from St. Paul really goes, in a mirror by means of an enigma. And mirrors and enigmas were the core of this late work. Figures that come and go. There's a third figure, as well as the figure walking, which is modelled on the Greek figures. There is actually a third figure inside the head itself. The god as archer, the idea of a very sort of hieratic figure. So this is the image of the god, and the god made the god as he walks among men, if you like. And the two aspects of Apollo completed by the third head. It all sounds so complicated the more you try to explain it, but the sculpture is beautifully simple. All you have to do is turn it, and the images dance, and the ideas are there without having to have too many words put around them. One of the late reflectors, and that brings us really to the end of Ayrton's career, was this one, Quest. And here he created with his own handprint the base and the back of the sculpture, and a single figure. And as you turn the sculpture, the figure confronts itself and moves through its own handprint. So it's a quest into identity, and identity was the nature of identity, the quest to find identity, what it means when you have. All of these things are aspects of what Ayrton was doing with his work, and he summed it up for himself in the painting collage, which he called Identity Card, and which is also in the exhibition here. It was completed at the end of October 1974, at which point, although he didn't know it, Ayrton had just about 1 year to live. He was only 54 when he died. But it is an image of the multiple identities that we all have, the mazes that we inhabit. And it was this idea of the multiplicity of personality and the way that we try to make sense of our lives that drove Ayrton throughout his career. I would like, he said, to be remembered as an image maker. And he talked about the way that making art is about discovering what is real through the making of images. I think this collection that we have here, I think, as I say, in some ways, I think the key works that we have here are the Minotaur works, and that the images of the Minotaur and his life are central to the way that Ayrton could take myth, give it a modern identity, while not losing the resonance of the past, exploiting that particular temporal frame of mythology, which is past and future and now, so that he mingled these ideas together. It's a concept which sounds like so many of his sculptures, complicated once you start putting words around it, but in practice, was spectacularly resonant and powerful, and these works continue to exert their fascination today.